Pleased to tell to everybody a warm welcome to this event, which was organized in a rather short time, but friendships, old friendships and connections matter in such moments. My friend Sorin Ionica thought that the Romanian Diplomatic Institute would be a good venue for this event, and he was right. So I'm very pleased to have as guest Dr. Anton Chekhovtsov, who is a Ukrainian political scientist, and he is specialized in and he worked a lot on the European radical right and its connection to the Kremlin, a subject that concerns some of us, or maybe all, and maybe that's why we are here. And his latest book, which he brought with him, Russian Political Warfare. That's the book. Obviously, you can order it online. Essays on Kremlin propaganda in Europe and the neighborhood, 2020-2023. We are now in 2024. I'm sure that there were developments. Meanwhile, I think that one of the very beneficial developments would be for us to realize that we are at war, or at least warfare. I'm very pleased that I have two students of mine here, and I had a course today, Foreign Policy and Diplomacy, and this is how I started the course. Do you think that Romania is at war? And there were one or two hands up, and in the end, I think I brought enough arguments to make them understand that at least we are in a gray war, to quote former MI6 director. But anyway, I don't want to monopolize. Let me invite Dr. Chekhovtsov to present, to make his presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, just to repeat myself, thank you very much for hosting me for the Institute, and thank you for the audience for this interest. I hope that we will also have a time in the second half of this event for the discussion. I must straight away just to congratulate to the perfect gender balance of the panel. This is something that needs to be recreated at many West European institutions where I sometimes talk as well. Since I think I was advised that the audience will be quite mixed, in the sense that some of you are students, some of you are experts, some of you are diplomats and ambassadors. So I try to structure the discussion that I will have with you in a way that probably would have interest to all elements of the audience. And I want to start with some theoretical considerations, then moving slowly, or sort of zooming in particular developments that are happening today. But before I do that, let me just explain to you what I do. I'm originally from Ukraine, from Sevastopol, where I haven't been for now more than 10 years already, because of the annexation, because of the occupation. But at the same time, my main sort of education came from the UK, where I did my PhD, and now I live in Austria, where I, on the one hand, lead a very small NGO, Center for Democratic Integrity, that looks in particular at attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. Mostly it's China, Russia. And at the same time, I do academic work. I'm affiliated with the Central European University and also University of Vienna. My background, my research background is the far right. This is where I academically come from. But in recent years, I also developed an interest in Russian politics, and as a crossover between these two fields, the relations between Russia and the far right in the West. Connections and relations which are quite dynamic. They're not frozen. There are interesting developments. There are negative developments, but also positive developments in a way in this field. But I'm sure we will have an opportunity to talk about this. So some of the terms that I will operate and some of the terms that I use in my studies is political warfare, but also malign influence. Talking about the Kremlin's malign influence in Europe or in the West in general, and the global South. So I'd like to present to you some of the sort of theoretical discussions, theoretical considerations, and I will start by saying that. Talking about malign influence, we should not forget there's also a concept of influence. Yeah, what is influence? It is it's the power to have an effect on people. And if we're talking about international relations, everybody or every country which feels that they have something to say, that they're competing in a particular area. Every country, every nation tries to exert influence on another nation. Yeah? And this is normal. This is a normal process. And there is nothing malign in this just idea of influence, of trying to convince others to accept our ideas, to accept our concepts, to accept our ways of life, or dealing with very small things, with small developments, even maybe economic developments. So we're trying to influence other people. Oops, I'm going to use this as well. And in particular, again, during peacetime, during a normal situation, the relations between countries, how we can influence them. Usually, there are many ways, obviously, but I would, in particular, talk about soft power. Yeah, and so first this soft power concept that was introduced by Joseph Nye back in the 90s, maybe even the end of the 1980s. It's about influencing other nations through affinity or attraction, using resources such as a nation's political values, culture, and foreign policy, and actually and using soft power in order to influence other nations has a very normative effect, because influencing others through soft power means that it is to show that we share the same values. We have the same values, we have this cultural background that we can share with you, and this also strengthens cooperation, and it also strengthens the values to which we refer. Yeah? We have the same values, and these values are good. So we should be together, we should cooperate. This is how we try to influence people. Another way is influence in peacetime. Right, yeah, it is obviously through diplomacy. Yeah? Diplomacy is a practice of conducting negotiations and dialogue between individuals and nations to achieve specific goals while maintaining peaceful relations. So, of course, diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, but also public diplomacy, it contributes to the dialogue between nations, and this is also one of the ways to influence, just influence. But, so this peacetime, and this influence, traditional influence, soft power, public diplomacy, is on the one side of the, say, developments. On the other side, you have a conventional war or kinetic war. This is when soft power does not work anymore. There are no shared values. We are at war with another nation. Diplomatic relations are usually ruined. We cannot really talk to each other the way that we talked. Yeah? So a conventional war in which direct physical force is actively used to engage an adversary and compel them to fulfill our will. Yeah? If during peacetime we also want other nations to somehow, follow us and fulfill our will, but we do it in a good way. Yeah? Shared values, diplomacy, dialogue, etc., etc. With kinetic war, obviously, it is through violence, it is through war. But, and this is one of my main points, is that between these two states, between peacetime and a conventional war, there is a huge gray area which some would refer to as political warfare. It's a concept that was introduced first by the Brits during the Second World War. There was an institution closely linked to the British anti-German, anti-Nazi propaganda apparatus. It was the Political Warfare Executive that first introduced this terminology of political warfare and tried quite actively to influence the politics of the Third Reich, of Nazi Germany, to undermine the will of Germans to conduct the war. So essentially it was not the first use of political warfare, obviously, but it was the first time when this term was introduced. Political war, as we can define it today, is about influencing the behavior and thinking of other nations using instruments and methods which go beyond traditional diplomacy, which go beyond soft power, but stop short of instruments and methods of a conventional war. So it is a place, it's a huge gray area in between these types of influence. And for this political warfare, if we are talking about influence, it is rather what I would define as malign influence. Yeah? Some of the concepts, because the idea of political warfare was reintroduced after the Second World War, and this is related mostly to American officials who decided that during the Cold War we would not like to have a high-order war with the Soviet Union, with our main adversary, but we would rather engage in political war. Yeah? And George Kennan defined the political war as employment of all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. And then he listed some of the methods of political warfare. So again, yeah, this is no longer diplomacy, this is not soft power, and yet this is not a conventional war. Probably the closest instrument that still part of political warfare, but not yet conventional war, is the support for paramilitary groups, for the various separatist movements inside the country that we consider to be our adversary. But it still falls into the category of political war, rather than being a typical conventional war. Probably I will just very briefly mention one of the key differences between the understanding of political war in the West and specifically in the US compared, say, to the political warfare of the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. And this is that for the US, political warfare would not really translate into a conventional war. They were separate. And they were considered to be separate, while for the Soviet Union, political warfare did not have this limitation, and it could develop into a conventional war from the failures of political warfare. So the Soviet Union, with their активные мероприятия, that was the term for political warfare during the Soviet times, they would easily go from political war to a conventional war, while Americans and the West in general would often stop. So if political warfare did not work, they would not go further. But I can give you examples of this a little bit later. So political warfare has its own advantages. And one advantage is that being engaged in political war, still if we want to influence someone, this political war helps avoid mass casualties. It is cheaper to execute. A very obvious example, if we take the realities of today, the entire budget probably for RT or for any other Russian disinformation channels, the annual budget could be the cost of maybe 2-3 tanks. So it's much cheaper to employ the propaganda machine and probably achieve the same results that a war could bring, but it would be cheaper than to have tanks operating. It also allows for maximum plausible deniability. It's very difficult in many cases to establish the origins of disinformation and propaganda, while it's much easier when we have physical presence of the troops. It also has its own disadvantages. Its effects take longer to develop. People who are engaged in political warfare never know, or more specifically, say disinformation. They never know when exactly it will have effect. Also, its intended impact is difficult to measure. Sometimes the attempts to understand how effective or how efficient the propaganda machine or disinformation machine, people who do this, they sometimes just start counting how many times a particular post on Facebook was shared. This is, we cannot say that it's about efficiency, but this is how desperate people are when they try to measure the actual success, the actual impact. And of course, political warfare often produces undesirable consequences. A couple of examples. In 2015, I guess the Russian disinformation machine produced this idea in Germany that there was a girl named Lisa, and she was raped by some migrants from the Middle East or some other countries. There was a huge scandal. There were protests organized around this bit of disinformation coming from the Russian side. But at the same, even Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of the Russian Federation, supported that narrative and helped spread it. But when the Germans realized that that was a bit of a disinformation, their eyes were opened to the workings of the Russian propaganda machine. Because before that case, that Lisa case, so-called Lisa case, many were not sure if the Russians were actually were involved in propaganda against Germany. But that case opened their eyes. And that exactly is the example of how political warfare may produce undesirable consequences. Another example is most likely from the Cold War, say when the Americans would support some of the paramilitary groups in Latin America, and then those paramilitary groups would get support from the US, especially financial support, material support, but then they would just cut any ties with Americans and pursue their own independent agenda that would sometimes be even to be in the opposition to the interest of the US. So again, political warfare may produce these undesirable consequences. Going back to the Russian political warfare, so strategic objectives, like why Russia is doing at the moment, or within the course of already maybe 10, 15 years, maybe even more, 20 years, why? And I would distinguish two strategic objectives. One is to protect Russian society from Western ideological, political, cultural, and other influences believed to undermine the grip on power held by the Putin regime. There is this very, very pragmatic approach. Yeah, so we are in power and we want to protect our power. We want to protect our regime, and we presume that the West is trying to undermine our regime through various means, through various instruments. There's also an ideological explanation to this. Why exactly? So what is the strategic objective ideologically? Well, this is, we have our Russian civilization, which is a separate civilization from the West. And the West has always been trying to undermine us. There is this eternal war between the West and the East. Currently, the West is represented by the US and by the American allies in Europe, and the East is now represented by us, by Russia, by the Russian civilization. So in order to protect this Russian civilization, we need to protect the Russian society, the Russian population from those Western influences, because these are enemy influences. Yeah? And as many of you may know, especially after the Second World War, countries very rarely declare wars in each other. It's all the wars that are taking place, or the majority. Actually, since the end of the Second World War, there was around, I think, 12 declarations of war. All the other military conflicts, they are driven by, we are defending ourselves. This is to protect us. This is why we attack other people or other nations. Yeah? So this is not a war. Yeah? We just are engaged in this in the defense, active defense. So what is Russia now doing? It can be also explained. The strategic objective is to protect the Russian civilization from what they believe to be a malign influence from the West. And of course, another strategic objective is to advance political, economic, and security interests of Putin's Russia on the international stage. This is about shaping the environment in which Russia is situated by changing that environment, making it more conducive to the Russian interests, however they are defined by the Kremlin. So it's about changing the environment. Yeah? So we protect ourselves, but also we want to change the environment. So there is somehow this the ecology of being protected, the environment that should be conducive to our interests. And obviously, political warfare is also about instruments. It's about tools of political warfare, and this is not an exhaustive list. But I just wanted for you to see that almost everything can be used for political warfare. We can build, actors may build political alliances with the opposition forces in the nations that are considered adversary. For example, the research that I mentioned to you in the very beginning, these relations between Russia and the far right. So when Russia is sort of supporting in one way or another far right political forces that are most likely than not are in the opposition to sort of centrist governments, center right or center left governments in Europe. So this is about being political. Building political alliances and trying to exert influence to advance your own foreign policy agenda through political alliances. Then, interference in elections, trying to somehow sway the elections, using agents of influence and front organizations and fake NGOs and think tanks. Using law in order to, for corrupt purposes, sometimes even using the pandemics. During the pandemic, 2020, probably you remember those stories of Russian aid to Italy and Serbia. That aid was mostly useless, but for the reputation, in order to show that Russia is trying to help even European countries, even NATO countries such as Italy, we are sending help, and the EU is not helping, NATO is not helping, but Russia is, coming to help. So it is used for political warfare as well. So, and you see many other instruments. But being more specific, and if we are talking about sort of giving names to those instruments that are very often used now or were used in the past. So this list or this table is about Russian actors. So who are those coordinators? Who are the sources of political warfare in the Russian Federation? I'm of an opinion which you may oppose, and some colleagues would probably not agree with me. But my opinion that there is no one center in the Russian Federation that manages all political warfare. There is no one center. There is no one sort of like a military desk from which all the decisions are coming. I'm of an opinion that there are different, sometimes even competing centers of power and centers of political warfare in the Russian Federation, that they have messages from the Kremlin. They know what should be done. They know what is expected from them, and they try themselves to carry out orders that were never given by the Kremlin, but they believe that by implementing those orders, by implementing bits of political warfare, they can be rewarded by the Kremlin for what they are doing. And there are many actors. Obviously, some of them are directly linked to the state. And first and foremost, those are siloviki. This is a Russian term for people who are related to power ministries, such as the defense ministry, or the main directorate of the General Staff, the GRU, Federal Security Services, and other services, basically. People who have access to the military power, or to the power of violence, siloviki. Then there are official structures. Presidential administration may be engaged in some of the parts of political warfare. Foreign Ministry, Committee of International Affairs of the State Duma. For example, many of the contacts, especially for political alliances, using political alliances for political warfare objectives are run by the parliament. I don't think that Russian parliament is a real parliament, but this is how it's called. And they also trying to build relations with representatives of European parliaments and parliaments across the world. Then you have political forces, United Russia, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, Communist Party, the business community, specifically those dealing with the energy supplies, Gazprom, Rosneft, but also bank structures like Raiffeisen Bank, state-sponsored media, RT and Sputnik, but not only them, social media propaganda networks. Internet Research Agency may not be that popular anymore because of the death of their boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin. A death that was, I think, quite expected after his failed coup last year. And then obviously there are Russian think tanks and foundations, Россотрудничество, which was sanctioned by the EU right after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then there are traditionalist bloc, Russian Orthodox Church, and anti-LGBT organizations. So these are coordinators, these are sources, many sources that are from Russia, that are engaged in this Russian political warfare. And now the question, so who are those, say, facilitators of Russian political warfare in the West, in Europe in particular? Yeah, so siloviki, the Russian siloviki, would often collaborate and collude with transnational organized crime organizations, with paramilitary groups. If you heard a recent story, a recent report on the killing of a Russian helicopter pilot who stole a helicopter from Russia and he brought it to Ukraine, and he was given protection by Ukraine, but then he decided that he asked to be issued a fake passport and he would go to live in Spain, and he was recently killed in Spain. The perpetrators have not yet been found, but the thing is that especially in Spain, Russian organized crime and connections with the organized crime are quite strong. So most likely that murder was coordinated by the Siloviki, by the Russian Siloviki, using all those criminal networks in Spain. Then there are official structures. Russian official structures would collaborate in the West with friendly academics, expert journalists, celebrities. Russian political forces would try to build relations with also political forces in Europe or front organizations. Business community, again, business partners of Russian companies, state-sponsored media would cooperate with websites amplifying Russian pro-Kremlin narratives. Here we could also mention, especially after 2022, various independent or so-called independent influencers in the West, like YouTube bloggers, who would not have any direct link to the Russian state media organizations, but who would collaborate with them secretly. And Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of RT, right after RT was banned by the EU in the beginning of March 2022, she said, so okay, now we are going to use some sort of underground guerrilla methods of information war. And what she meant in the end is that this covert collaboration between RT and allegedly independent influences in the West. Because what happened with RT, it became really toxic. For example, Twitter had to mark RT at that time before Musk's to take over. They had to mark RT as a Russian state-sponsored organization, and people who would work for RT would also be marked as a person working for the Russian state organizations. But if you look like an independent blogger, nobody would be able to produce this connection, and you would still be regarded as an independent influence, as an independent vlogger or blogger. So that was these underground methods of collaborating with like-minded individuals in the West, right? So social media propaganda networks, working with particular individuals from the anti-establishment organizations, from the far right to the far left. Think tanks and foundations would again engage with friendly Western academics, experts and journalists, and the traditional bloc, the National Orthodox churches, anti-LGBT organizations. So probably that, these links, they are not extremely strict. There is a level of free development. Some coordinators may also work with other facilitators of Russian political warfare in the West. There may be some also overlaps, but in general, I think the picture is as it was presented here. Now, zooming in and going to closer to our period, at the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014. That started with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine in spring 2014. So what are main reasons as I see them? It is, of course, to now, what are the strategic objectives today of the Russian Federation, concerning and how this political warfare is used and why it is used. It is to undermine Western military, economic, and political support of the Ukrainian leadership. For Ukraine. It's so distrust towards the Ukrainian leadership domestically and internationally, and in the end, so where it all comes to, it is to destroy the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian national identity. That in Putin's mind, or in the minds of those who are very close to Putin, the mere existence of Ukraine undermines the worldview and the idea of the Russian civilization. And because they believe that Ukrainians are just confused Russians, they cannot accept the idea that Ukraine can modernize along the Western lines and join the West, because the foundation of the idea and of the concept of Russian civilization, that this cannot be part of the West. We are a separate civilization. But if you have this successful example of one part of your civilization becoming part of the West, then the whole structure of your concept is ruined. It is undermined. This is why this problem, this Ukrainian problem, needs to be solved by just the destruction of it. And now I want to... I still have some time. Or how much? Okay. All right. Now, since I was talking, as I showed you that table with various tools and instruments of political warfare, now I want to zoom in more in this disinformation and propaganda issues and identify for you some of these narratives and some of the audiences, because I do believe it is very important to understand that the Russian propaganda machine is targeting not only the Western countries, but also its own domestic audience, the Ukrainian audience, and also more recently the global South. So I also identify two types of narratives of the propaganda machine relate to the Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So one type of narratives is strategic narratives, which reflect the genuine understanding or interpretation of the Russian political elites of the conflict with Ukraine and the conflict with the West. This is what they actually believe in. This is not simply a lie. This is not necessarily correct what they believe in, but they genuinely believe in this. This is their honest delusion, at least. And usually these strategic narratives, they're more or less coherent. They're quite logical. Again, not necessarily they're right, not necessarily correct, but they're coherent. And another type of narratives which I identify is tactical narratives. They just serve as individual steps that aim to strengthen the validity of strategic narratives, or more often to address emergent information threats. I will give you examples. And unlike strategic narratives, these technical narratives are less coherent. They are usually very often they're based on emotions. They may emerge, they may die away, and they may re-emerge again. So this is something that is not necessarily very important. And there are many of them. There are many more tactical narratives, obviously, than strategic narratives. Some of them actually oppose each other. Tactical narratives may oppose each other because it doesn't really matter whether they are right or wrong. They may be incoherent, but their main objective is just to support the strategic narratives. Again, I will give you examples. And then I also, as I said, just to repeat myself, identify four main audiences of this Ukraine war-related Russian propaganda. It's domestic audience in Russia, Ukrainian audience, Western audience, audience of the global South. Obviously, we can make distinctions between, say, audiences in the Baltic states and audiences in Portugal, or audience in Hungary and audience in Sweden. They may be different, but still, I think for a more or less bigger picture, I guess this distinction into four audiences makes sense. So, for example, strategic narratives for Russian domestic audience, what they tell their own population, how they justify the so-called special military operation. The Ukrainian nation does not exist. Yeah? Ukrainians are confused or manipulated Russians. It just probably, or the Austrians or the Poles manipulated Russians into believing that they're somehow different from the Russians, and then you suddenly have Ukrainians out of nothing, out of manipulation. So this is not real. The Ukrainian state is not real. So as a country, Ukraine was granted existence only by Russia. I'm sure you know this idea about Lenin being the father of the Ukrainian nation. Sovereign Ukraine is a project of anti-Russia. So everything that is Ukrainian is anti-Russian. To this actually relates the idea of denazification of Ukraine as one of the objectives of the special military operation. I'm sure many of you don't know, and this is something that I got to know also quite recently. You know that the book Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, when it was translated, one of the first translations of this book into Russian for the political leaders of the Soviet Union, was done in an extremely manipulative way. They manipulated the translation in order to identify the main victims or the main targets of the Nazi Germany, not the Jews, but the Slavic people. So they just cut some of the original pieces of Hitler's book in order to switch, in order to show that the Russians were the main target of fascism and not the Jews. And from this, you have an interpretation of fascism as something deeply, well, first anti-Soviet, but also anti-Russian. And the idea is that if you have those people who say, well, we are not Russians, or who would criticize Russia, and especially Ukrainians who would say, well, we are Ukrainians, we are not Russians, almost automatically you can qualify them as fascists. So if they deny that they are Russians, if they are against Russia, then through this history of Soviet misuse of the ideology of it, or misinterpretation of it, deliberate misinterpretation of it, basically you can define everything that is anti-Russian, or if you see anti-Russian, this is necessarily fascist. This also explains much of this confusion when Russia on the one hand would say, those European fascists, they are against Russia or whatever, there is a revival of Nazism, and at the same time they would invite people coming from the far-right organizations to advance Russian foreign policy interests. But if they are pro-Kremlin, if they're pro-Russian, they can't be fascists, because fascism is deeply anti-Russian. This is the interpretation, and this is how it is. This problem is solved in the minds of the Russian political elites. So, anti-Russia is if sovereign Ukraine is a project of anti-Russia, then necessarily Ukraine is a fascist regime, is a fascist country, which needs to be denazified, which means Ukraine needs to be de-Ukrainized. Yeah? It needs to stop being Ukrainian and start being a Russian. So these are strategic narratives for the Russian audience. Then they have many tactical narratives, and again, they are very often short-lived. So the war is not a war; it's a special military operation. This is actually understandable, and as I said, very rarely nations declare wars after the Second World War. And especially, actually, I'm sure many of you know that in the Constitution, no, not in the Constitution, in the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, it is a criminal offense to start a war. So Putin obviously could not go strictly against the criminal code, and he could not start an aggression. It was a special military operation. And also, many people actually laugh at this, ridicule the idea. It's a special military operation, for 3 days. Actually, it was meant to be 3 days. And they were quite close. to finish everything in 3 days if they were able to take out the Ukrainian leadership. Ukraine, obviously, I'm sure, would not have the same the military support from Western allies in the same degree. So another technical narratives, again, Ukrainians who oppose Russian rule are Nazis. NATO uses Ukraine to attack Russia. No, and especially after the first victories of the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, they could no longer say, those Ukrainians, so we were defeated somehow, but not by Ukrainians, because Ukrainians are, it's not a real nation. I mean, they cannot fight. No, it was NATO who defeated us. So we are fighting against NATO. It's a way to sort of psychologically explain why Russia had to withdraw from some of the territories that it managed to occupy in the first weeks of the invasion. And Russia never lost wars, which is obviously untrue. So the idea, the tactical narrative, we will necessarily win. So there is no other chance. We never in our history we lost wars. So these are tactical narratives. You see it on the screen. I want to focus again very briefly. This Ukraine's leaders are Satanists. That was a very peculiar narrative that emerged right after the Russia declared this partial mobilization, and that I think was autumn 2022, if I'm not mistaken, or 23? No, 22. So they declared partial mobilization, and there was an incident in one of the military camps in the Russian Federation when two recruits from Muslim background, they shot around 10 other Russian officers and soldiers. And the reason why they would do this is that the commander of that unit, he somehow insulted Islam and Muslim faith. So those soldiers, they were quite angry, and they just shot the people from their own unit. And at that time, also, there was a fear on the part of some Russian commanders and military personnel that there could be this interreligious conflict inside the Russian troops, inside the Russian military machine, and in order, interfaith conflict, and in order to explain to them that it doesn't really matter what your faith is, you are anyway fighting against Satan or Shaitan or any other diabolical figure that is the leadership of Ukraine. So, you Christians, Orthodox Christians and Muslims and probably Buddhists, you can all find unity in this fight against Ukraine, which is satanic. So this is that was the narrative. Sometimes it actually goes away, and then Ramzan Kadyrov will again somehow use this narrative, or Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of the Russian Federation. But usually this is the narrative that emerges, then days out, then re-emerges again. So it's a tactical narrative. It doesn't really matter. Another tactical narrative, maybe I haven't put it here, just to show you that they may not be coherent. For example, again, in Putin's words, Ukraine is a fascist country, it's a fascist regime, but at the same time, at the end of last year, he would say, well, yeah, Ukraine is not a country, it's not a real state, it doesn't have an ideology. And I would say, wait. So Ukraine has no ideology, but then how can you say it's fascist? Because fascism is an ideology. But it doesn't really matter. Because on the one hand, you say that Ukraine is a fascist country because you want to undermine Western support for Ukraine, right? From liberal states. But then you say Ukraine is not even a country. Again, it serves the interest undermining support for Ukraine. Why do you support something that is not even a country? So it doesn't really matter if those tactical narratives are coherent, if they serve the strategic narratives. Ukraine audience, of course, they cannot straightforwardly say that Ukraine does not exist. No, they would say Russians and Ukrainians are brotherly nations. They would say Ukraine is part of the Russian civilization. Ukraine can only be successful together with Russia. We may also talk about, but I will not do this because probably my time is running out, that there is also a difference what Ukrainian audience, either they are on occupied territories and on the territories still in the sovereign Ukraine. So there is this difference as well. Tactical narratives, so Ukrainian leadership betrays the interest of the ordinary Ukrainian people. The West will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. So, the West is using you. You need to surrender because otherwise, no, the West is fighting against us, using you as a cannon fodder. So this is one of the narratives. Then this gay Europa narrative, the West is degenerate and Ukraine should not join it because of the LGBT and blah, blah, blah. Narrative for the Western audiences, again, strategic. Russia is a global power that has a right to have its own sphere of influence, and Ukraine belongs there. Ukraine, as part of the West, poses as an existential threat to Russia. The West is encircling Russia. And these are strategic narratives. They actually believe in what they're saying here. But then there are many more tactical narratives. For the Western audience. The West is Russophobic, the West somehow hates Russia. This is why the West is doing what it is doing. Western sanctions are damaging for European businesses. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It cannot be part of the West. Ukraine has an immense Nazi problem. Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Many more. European support for Ukraine will result in the geopolitical decline of Europe. The US is playing its European allies. It's against the sort of interests of European sovereign states. That there is a nuclear threat. I'm sure you're well familiar with this. And the Global South. For the Global South, it's a little bit different because some of the narratives that are used for Western audiences, for Russian audience, they would not work for the Global South, especially for, say, geographically distant areas like Latin America and Africa, and specifically because there is obviously a problem for many, not even for Russia, to understand why the Global South or Latin American countries or African countries, why they should rather support Ukraine. For them, as you may imagine, one white nation is killing other white nation, so what's the actual difference? Is it our problem? Is it our war? So they would rather use narratives that are close, that are sensitive for the Global South, such as Russia is the leader of the global anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist front. The West is using the Ukraine war to reclaim global domination. So Ukraine here is actually not in the focus. It's not about Ukraine. It's about the West. It's about the Western imperialism. Ukraine is part of the Russian legitimate sphere of influence. And tactical narratives like Western support for Ukraine is driven by Western anti-Russian racism. Racism is a sensitive issue for the Global South. Nazism, probably not, because this is something on the outskirts of the discussions in the Global South. Ukraine, with Western support, endangers global food security. Food security, again, very important, a very sensitive issue for the Global South. Ukraine is developing biological weapons with Western support. And these biological weapons, again, is a very sensitive issue for the Global South, especially for Africa, where there are a lot of conspiracy theories about the West inventing various biological weapons in order to control the size of populations in Africa. So, it is about using already existing conspiracy narratives and putting some anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian elements into that. So, obviously, all these narratives, they may overlap. And some of the narratives that are strategic narratives for the Global South, they can be used, say, by far left activists in the West, or some of the narratives that are tailored for the Russian domestic audience, especially traditionalist or even Ukrainian audience, about traditionalists, about this anti-LGBT rhetoric that can be also used and can be useful for the Western right-wing forces. And even this idea about biological weapons, this idea is very popular, say, with right-wing conspiracy theorists in the US. So there may be overlaps. Again, this is not a strict classification, but I think it gives you, this picture how Russia is using particular sensitivities, sensitive issues, exploiting weaknesses to influence. I would say, exerting malign influence, because it goes against the values of Western societies, or the European values, and how Russia in many ways can be successful. I am sure that, talking, say, about efficiency of whether these narratives are, efficient. Well, let me say, if you heard any of this, then Russia has achieved at least 1/3 of its objective. It managed to deliver those narratives to you personally, either via the media or your colleagues or maybe your friends. So that was the delivery. About these narratives. It doesn't mean that they were 100% successful, but I'd say 30%. If you or your colleagues or friends believe that some of these narratives are legitimate points of view, I think the efficiency is like 2/3, maybe 60%. And of course, if I'm sure probably not you, but some other people believe that this is the actual truth, then it's 100% success. But again, with political warfare, it's very difficult to measure the success. With conventional war, it's easy. You have a rocket, you hit a target, you are 100% successful. But with the disinformation narratives, with propaganda, you never know. It may work today, it may work tomorrow, or maybe in 1 year, or it may not work at all. So I will stop here, and I was also going to go through other topics, but we can, I think, do it during our discussion. Thank you very much for your interest and attention.
I think this was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure that the students here appreciated the systematic character, not only the substance of what you said, but also the systematic matter in which you presented. So thank you very much on their behalf as well as ours as hosts. Sorin?
Okay, it's my turn to thank both of you, actually, Liliana, the gracious host of this event, and Anton for being here. And this is part of a long-term effort, I have to say, to make connections with the Ukrainian thinking community, with the Ukrainian NGOs, from the part of us, Expert Forum. And I think we need that, particularly in Romania, because we have a certain historically a blind spot toward the East. This is a space we don't understand very well. We don't have a tradition in speaking the languages, reading, understanding. So we need to make these connections, to understand better what is going there, to understand the perspective. And this is why we have Anton here in Bucharest. He is very well known. And this connection between the Kremlin world and the European extreme right, which is going to influence the European elections we are going to have in June, it's something very important we need to discuss. Now, and of course I have to repeat what Liliana said before. His book is on sale, so even after these events, you can have this book.
It's cheaper than online.
Yes, it's cheaper than online, so you can have it here on the spot for less money than you order it on Amazon. And now our role, Otilia and mine, is to be co-discussants about it. I have a number of questions. I will just shoot them very quickly. Otilia has one more, and then we will open to the audience as we promised. And I will start with two broad, I hope difficult questions for Anton. One is about the real life, what is going on. The other one is about the propaganda in the online. About the real life, you know, we have this, speaking about this modus operandi of Kremlin and Siloviki and the elites, right? So on the one hand, you can have Putin and the whole hierarchy giving orders, shoot this guy, eliminate this guy, or do this and that in Europe. So a certain chain of command. On the other hand, we know that there is a certain ecosystem that you described around the Kremlin of semi-independent operators. They may be state actors, non-state actors, oligarchs, of marginals from society. They took part in the invasion of Crimea, of course, you know, bikers, Malofeev, religious actors, who, in a way, as you described, they anticipate the unspoken wishes of Kremlin. They move forward out of their own initiative, and probably they expect a reward after that if they are successful. If not, and this is very advantageous for Kremlin because it's deniable. You know, these guys moved, you know, independently. This is true in a way, you know. My question for you is, what is balance between these things? Because at least here in Romania or in Europe, we tend to interpret every event as a direct order from Putin. Navalny was a direct order from Putin. Or was some semi-independent actor moving, I don't know, some top Siloviki who was hating Navalny personally, and he did it without Putin's direct knowledge. Same Nemtsov and the other cases, or cases in Europe. So what is your feeling about that? So yeah, let's take them one by one, and I'll ask the other one.
All these cases, I think they're quite different. I will just share my own opinions about who could be behind those things. I think Nemtsov was, it was not the Kremlin. I think it was most likely that was the Kadyrov's guys or Kadyrov who acted independently and thinking that he was doing something great for the Kremlin, and, you know, or responding to maybe the wishes as he interpreted them. The wishes of Putin or maybe someone. I think with Navalny, it is, for me, it's quite clear that it's Putin himself. It was a, I don't think that he gave a direct order to kill Navalny in that prison camp, but the order was given several years ago already, and it was not, you know, it was still in force. And sending Navalny to that prison camp, to that colony, that was just a very slow execution. Those are conditions of life where you cannot really live, especially after the poisoning. And the Novichok poisoning obviously had a very damaging impact on Navalny's health. It was very clear right after he was arrested, after his return to Russia, that they will do something with him. Yeah, the only chance for him was to be exchanged. But anyway, so the idea is that it all depends on individual cases. And indeed, of course, there are many, even freelancers, maybe not that important, but who want to enter that political warfare and maybe offer some of the instruments, some of the successes, if they are successful. And in this connection, I want to tell you that I myself saw, while doing this research on Russian political warfare, I saw a lot of failed campaigns. I saw a lot of failed projects of the Russian political warfare that simply did not work for one reason or another. And one other thing is that we are actually quite lucky that Russia is such a corrupt society, because okay, you can have money from one oligarch and businessman. Obviously, he or she will not do it directly, but that would be a chain of that money. Of those payments to a particular person who does actual political warfare, and this money is being stolen on all the stages because of corruption. This is good, you know. We are really lucky. I mean, if all those resources went straight to the people who actually carry out those operations, we would have been in in a worse situation. So we are lucky in this sense. But indeed, there are Siloviki, there are state state-sponsored operations, but there are a lot of operations, especially when it comes to maybe journalists and political forces, sometimes even and other experts. There is a lot of freelance.
Okay, and the other related is about propaganda and influence. Okay, they do a lot, and you showed the instruments and the strategic and the tactical narratives. What about us? I mean, how Putin put it, the collective West. Can we, do you think it's realistic that at some point we use more strategically the Western resources and the deep knowledge about the Russian society of the Ukrainians, the Balts, the Moldavians, to turn the table? Why don't we do active measures towards the Russian society to undermine all these narratives? Because my feeling is we are very, very passive in this. Is it a realistic prospect, or I'm just naive thinking this way?
No, the West does political warfare against the Russian Federation. For example, one of the instruments of political warfare is economic sanctions. It's economic coercion. So the West is doing this. The West is also does political alliances with the Russian opposition, the Russian democratic opposition. This is also part of political warfare. Russians are supporting the far right in Europe. The West is supporting the pro-democratic, pro-Western opposition in the Russian Federation. But the problem, I think, is what I mentioned with these limitations of political warfare. The West is limited in what it can do because of the democratic procedures. The West cannot really allow for so many freelancers to be engaged in in the activities that go beyond sometimes even legal limitations. It's very difficult for the West to conduct this. Another limitation is, for example, I don't want to give any names now, but I know several pro-Western Russian organizations that are based in the West, and they support the Russian opposition. They are being very active actually in working on the sanctions, but at the same time they are unable to support, say, the Russian armed resistance to the Kremlin regime. Now you probably heard of those military groups in Ukraine, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Siberian Battalion. Many organizations in the West are not able to support them because that would be support for the armed resistance inside Russia. And in many cases, the democratic procedures just because of that they are unable to support them, and then you basically fragment some of the Russian opposition forces. So the West is trying to do its own political warfare. You know that in Brussels there is Stratcom. Stratcom, strategic communication, this is what we call propaganda when we don't want to use this word, because propaganda is something dirty and strategic communication is nice. So yes, it works in this way, although this propaganda is only targeting basically the European states or the EU, so they would know what things are propaganda or disinformation or fake news and what's not. And it's not targeting the Russians. If you remember, there were several initiatives to launch Russian language TV and program. Well, this is also political warfare. This is also if you say, or you can say strategic communication with the Russians, trying to convince them, trying to change their mindset, trying to change their, worldviews. But there are many limitations. And let me, I do think it's probably important to look from a bit different angle in this situation with political warfare. And this is an example from history. 1956. There was almost a revolution in Hungary, right? There was an uprising against the pro-Soviet, pro-socialist regime. Part of this revolution, one major factor, probably not the most important, one major factor in that some people decided to rise up against the pro-Soviet government was the work of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was at that time funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. It was a project of the CIA. It was basically a black propaganda. And they were successful. Yeah, so they convinced the population to rise up against the socialist regime. And they did this. And then the Soviets just bring tanks. So it's all over. So you can be very successful with political warfare, but for the Soviets, and as I said, there is no limit for them. So the Americans would stop. Yeah, they were successful with political warfare, but that's it, because political warfare can never be part of the conventional war. And for the Soviets, just, yeah, so what? Okay, good, you did good, and we bring tanks, and then it's all over. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking more countries like Latvia or Moldova, where you have a substantial section of the population which is part of the Ruski Mir. They are prisoners in the propaganda. They only watch Privesc Canal, and they get their worldview from these sources. But the Russians do not control the territory. We don't have, like in Moldova, a Russian-speaking channel to give them an objective view of world affairs. And this is a very big problem, because we leave them there, we don't care about this portion of the Ruski Mir, and they have no alternative in the Russian language. And Russian is important because that's the limit of the bubble. You know, they don't listen to anything else but to things that come in Russian. And we never made this effort to have a clean, nice channel TV, good with professional images, to reflect an objective view of the world affairs for them. And then they will continue to watch Privesc Canal and all these guys. Yeah.
But it really depends on the size of those communities, because, you know, it's one thing when we are dealing, well, when the Baltic states are dealing with their Russian-speaking communities, and honestly, I think the threat was at that time exaggerated, because Russian-speaking Estonians, they can compare how life is in Russia and how life is in Estonia. So there wasn't much of a, nostalgia about anything Russian. But it really depends on the size. Obviously, there are also Russian speakers in Portugal, but I don't think it makes actual sense to have any, sort of media targeting particular, Russian-speaking Portuguese. So it depends on the size of those communities.
I also want to make a comment and actually want to ask you. So it's obvious that there is an asymmetry between the so-called collective West. I have an objection to that, but that's later. and Russia, because I think there are proofs, but I don't know how closed they are in terms of exposure of the citizens to internet, to social media. I know that they have open YouTube, if I'm right, and I know that they closed Twitter, X, whatever, Facebook. The Russian public. I'm talking about the asymmetry between the Russian public and the so-called Western public, because I think this matters a lot. So if you would like to comment on that.
It's actually a great question. And I want to answer it again with a very brief reference to the history and to the Cold War, especially in the 1980s. And some of you may have heard of the so-called Operation Infection, or Operation Detroit. That was about basically a Soviet active measure aiming to show that the emergence of AIDS was linked to the secret laboratories in the US. So that this pandemic, global pandemic, was produced by the Americans. And in order to do this, they had to publish this piece in an Indian newspaper, Patriot, and then they would have another person in GDR who would refer to that article in India and produce this, exposure of the Americans being behind the AIDS. So at that time, it actually took them several years in order to plant this narrative in the Western media environment. And it's still alive. This idea that AIDS was created by the Americans, still alive in many pockets of the even American society. So they were hugely successful. But now it takes you maybe a day or 2 days in order to plant a narrative Russian narrative, disinformation narrative, into the American, Western media space,
Which is open.
which is not only open, it's shut open.
Exactly.
It's just welcoming everything that you can put it. So of course, and this is in a huge contrast to what the Russians themselves, I mean, the Russian authorities are doing for the Russian environment. It's not that they cannot access Facebook; they can. It's not that they cannot access YouTube; they can. But it's a small number, and also the majority of the Russians, they take their information from TV. And TV, you switch on it's only Kremlin-approved TV stations. You cannot have any independent media on the TV, and this is the main source of information for them. So they have essentially closed their information system, while they are using the openness of the Western information system to attack it. And this is a problem that actually is very difficult to find solution. Whether
Not
it is
impossible if we put ourselves this question.
yes, but then the question will be whether we are not, or whether we are actually becoming those who we are fighting against. So there will be always this democratic discussion, how far we can go, how far we can control. There is a consensus essentially in Western societies about propaganda. It is allowed during the elections, and it is allowed in the business relations. So advertisement is propaganda, right? Political parties competing with each other in the elections is propaganda, but it is allowed. There is a consensus. It is fine. But when the government uses propaganda on their own citizens, then democratic societies have problems.
Yes, at the same time, if we accept that we are under political warfare situation, we need to acknowledge that. But the thing is, I think that it's difficult to persuade a large majority of citizens here and in other countries in the West of this. That's my view.
My point was to target the Russian public, not our public.
I agree. No, I agree. But
Otilia,
Yeah, but again, the problem is that they have closed this information
Exactly.
system. They are defending their own information environment from us.
Yes, I also have two questions. The first one is actually more of a comment leading to a question. In the past 2 years, in the Western media, there have been a lot of dubious articles. For example, when there was the explosion of Nord Stream 2, there was a story that there might be some 2 Ukrainians with a boat, going by themselves, or maybe paid by Zelensky. Then there was there was a rumor in autumn, so again at a critical moment, last autumn, that Putin might be open to negotiations. And other stories as well. The story about Patrushev organizing the death of Prigozhin without, trying to absolve Putin from any kind of involvement, saying that he may have been only informed. Some of these are debunked later. Others are debunked only in Russian-speaking audiences, like, for example, Christo Grozev, yes, on TV Dozhd. But I'm wondering, to what extent is there a sense that these are active measures of Russia, or there are simply vulnerabilities of the Western media, in the sense that we in the West are not so prepared to deal with the depth of lies, and we are much more vulnerable to fake information, dubious sources, or don't go through the same rigor that we should be going to check from 10 sources certain piece of information. And in this particular sensitive moment, how can we better manage this information which can actually influence the West, into less support for Ukraine?
Good question.
It's a dubious, yes, it's a, yes. Yeah, so to what extent is it Russian intervention or Western vulnerability? And to what extent this Western vulnerability has a solution? We can do something about it.
Okay, so, well, these three examples that you presented, I think they're all quite different in their nature, actually. With the explosions and with the destruction of Nord Stream 2, well, we don't know. A colleague of mine, Andreas Sumland, wrote a very interesting post saying that those people who say that was Ukrainians, it's actually giving Ukrainians a lot of credit that they were able to carry out such a brilliant operation. No, let me be fair with you. Ukraine was interested in destroying Nord Stream 2. We all were, right? And if Ukrainians managed to do this and now they have this plausible deniability, well, kudos to Ukraine. You know, when it all happened also, there was a Twitter post by Radoslav Sikorsky, now current foreign minister of Poland, thanking the US for the destruction of Nord Stream 2. So whoever was behind, well, we don't know, yeah, and we can only speculate. Maybe we will know in some time. But I think this piece is different from other examples. As for the death of Prigozhin, well, I wonder if you didn't have that feeling after Prigozhin stopped his raid on Moscow that he was a dead man walking. You know, there was no chance that he would survive what he tried to do. That was sort of high treason in the eyes of the Siloviki clan of Putin. It was just a matter of time. It was very clear that he would be dead, and Putin would not probably even need to say directly to Patrushev to do something. He would only say, like, you know, we have to deal with this somehow, or something else. Obviously, Putin would not, I think, do it, personally, of course. And the third example was about negotiation. This, I think, is a very, very clear активные мероприятия, piece of political warfare, a bit of political warfare on the Russians' part. This is to send a message that that Russia is open to negotiations, which means that the West should no longer provide military support for Ukraine because it just prolongs the war that could otherwise be ended with negotiations, and this gives more time for the Russians because the more time they have, better it is for their war effort. So this, I have no doubts that it was somehow planted, this narrative was planted in the Western media, this negotiations thing. This is just a bit of disinformation. What can we do about this? With some things, we cannot do anything. And let me be fair, this is my genuine perspective, that for some things, there are no countermeasures at all, except for, social resilience, building that resilience, which takes years and not days and not a couple of workshops for the media workers. It takes years. It is about media literacy. Another thing is that I also don't think that debunking works somehow efficiently. I was quite skeptical for a very long time about this. Because it has to do with psychology. And because it has to do a lot with psychology, I think another instrument could be much more efficient. This is pre-bunking, which is based on the theory in communication theory about inoculation. Inoculation theory, which goes this way. When we are not aware, when we have no direct knowledge about a particular development or event that happens somewhere in the world, we tend, as humans, as humans, we psychologically are inclined to believe in the first interpretation of that event or development that we hear or read. If we don't know anything about this, the first thing that we read about this, we will believe in this, and we will also defend this interpretation against later interpretations. We can be reconvinced, we can be, but generally, just psychologically, we will stick to this first interpretation. which means that it is very important for the media, but for also those organizations like Stratcom, to come up quickly with, say, fact-based, objective interpretation of particular events. Because the longer it takes for Western institutions and objective media, free media, to come up with these objective interpretation, the more you will have conspiracy theories and disinformation around it, and people will not even listen to your interpretation. It's just about time. It's very simple. It's really about the period of time during which those conspiracy theories and disinformation narratives can be developed. One, in my opinion, brilliant example of how pre-bunking works, it's what the US and the UK and some other allies started doing back in 2021, saying Russia is gearing up for the invasion of Ukraine. And compare that situation to February, the end of February 2014, when those little green men appeared in Crimea, and Russia was given several weeks of basically plausible deniability, saying that's not us. Those may be, pro-Russian separatists in Crimea. That's not us. And everybody was confused because they didn't wear any insignia. And that gave Russia a crucial time of 2-3 weeks to do what they actually did. There was this confusion in the Western mind. So the services, obviously, I have no doubt that the secret services of the West knew what was going on. But politically and for the establishment, Russians are saying that's not them, so maybe it is the case, maybe it's not, but we don't know how we can act upon something that we don't know. Yeah? And then when the 24th of February 2022 happened, everybody knew what was happening because the US and the UK pre-bunked anything that Russia could have produced to explain what was going on. They had no chance to convince anyone or even confuse anyone about what was going on. And, just to give you an example from this more focused research of mine, Marine Le Pen, on the 24th of February 2022, the person who took the 9 million euros loan from the Russian bank back in 2014, unequivocally condemned the Russian invasion on the same day, because nobody could be fooled anymore what was going on. That was the success of the pre-bunking strategy, of the inoculation theory. The US and the UK inoculated us and the international community about what would be happening in the future. So we were ready for any lies that the Russia would like to produce.
Can I just wanted to come back to this so-called collective West. It's true that we are using inverted commas when use that, but we are using the narrative imposed by Moscow. And I think this is wrong. And I think maybe we can think, as we call ourselves the collective West, what can the collective West really do, not only to react, but actually to act, because this inoculated idea that it's the West, it comes as a continuation of the Cold War, saying, the capitalists, the bad guys are there. Look, Global South or New South. Look how what are they actually doing? So this is one point. Maybe I will come back later.
And continue to use it, but sarcastically, as I did, in order to pre-bunk Putin's narrative. I suggest we open it with the audience, and I suggest we take 3 interventions. I have 1, 2, 3. Gentlemen, please keep them short and introduce yourself, Mr. Fota.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to have a question. You had a very interesting presentation, but I want to take also some personal benefit from your presence here. And my question is about Romania. I mean, starting from your deep experience on European far right, and I guess also on Russian far right. My question is, do you have anything to tell us about the Romanian far right? And in your long years researches, you notice anything interesting about our Romanian far right and maybe some possible connections with the Russian far right? Thank you.
Take all three, and then Anton will respond. The gentleman over here. Yes, please.
Researcher at the
In the microphone, please.
Law Research Institute, Romanian Academy. Do you think there are two kinds of Ukrainian in Putin's mind? Those who are in the West, in the West, in Halic, Volhynia, perhaps Greco-Catholics, who are irreductibles and who cannot be longer be converted, and those in the South, Center, and in East, who can easily be re-Russified, because when in every evening when I try to enter on Facebook, Twitter to see how the front is in Avdiivka, there are thousands of vatniks on the internet who bombard me with the maps of Medvedev with the little part of Ukraine, and they try to insert a narrative which is very interesting for the Romanian far right about Chernouts and all the things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That map is very popular with Romania because he gives us Vinica Oblast, which is quite an interesting idea. Please, Jen, over there.
Thank you. So some years ago, I remember you were talking about the mimetic power
Would you
of
introduce
Russia.
yourself?
Sorry, Radu Pieka, Wall Street. The mimetic power of Russia, and I think this is very insidious and more dangerous even than conspiracy theories, because this works very well with global Western media and especially Romanian media to treat Russia like a normal power. And I will give you an example from my experience. I was a news editor for years for a major TV station, the largest TV station in Romania. And the guys who were writing the foreign news were always asking me, why don't we ask the Russian embassy or the North Korean embassy? Why don't we ask them for their point of view? And I was trying to explain to them, there's nothing you can ask them. And they were complaining all the time, it's not fair. Why don't we treat them as a normal country and as a normal diplomatic power? Thank you.
As for the relations between, say, Romania and far right, there were several organizations, but mostly on the fringes. When I was looking at the Romanian context, I cannot say that I was specifically, being, really focused on the Romanian case. But there were some fringe organizations that were very close to the Russians, like the New Right. I think in Romania it's a Noua Dreapta, that were quite close to the sort of Russian neo-Eurasianists. Fortunately or unfortunately, maybe I shouldn't use this term at all, but in 2014 I was trying to follow also what Vadim Tudor had to say about this, but he died quite quickly. So we couldn't know how he would develop, because he was not known in particular of being pro-Russian, but at the same time he had this idea obviously of a greater Romania, and where parts of Ukraine would be part of this. So he would always talk about Ukrainians stealing parts of the Romanian land. So that would be interesting to see, but it's not possible now. As for Romania is in many ways, I guess, lucky because of this historical skepticism towards Russia, despite the shared religion of Christian Orthodoxy. But those are usually, in my opinion, small organizations and smaller far-right forces in Romania that are being sort of blatantly, openly pro-Russian. And I am now told about other parties such as AUR Yeah, but this is something that I must tell you honestly, I haven't looked closely into this. As for the second question, can you remember the second question? Just to say a few.
Maps of Medvedev.
Yeah, Medvedev.
No. Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Catholics.
Yeah, so obviously there are so many approaches to those Ukrainians. I remember one of the at least early explanations coming from these far-right geopolitical authors in Russia, where they would say that basically the entire Ukraine has to be part of the Russian Empire, except for 3 West Ukrainian oblasts who are Greek Catholic, and we will not be able to Russianize them anyway, and they're a trouble, and we don't really need them. So they can be an independent Ukraine, or the remnants of independent Ukraine, or they can go to Poland, or Romania, Hungary may take some of those other territories, so we don't need them anymore. Yes. Then there was this idea, because there are so many of them, yeah, we cannot really put them into 1 or 2 coherent categories. So those were irredeemables, so incorrigible Ukrainians. We cannot do anything about them. But now with many radicals, they would say yes. So mostly entire Ukraine, we can include them in this Russian civilization, Russian world, and those who cannot be corrected, they should just be killed. And it so happens that now it is the majority of Ukrainians who needs to be corrected by denazifying them, meaning by killing them. It's a genocidal program. It's not about changing the ideology. Every Ukrainian who believes that he has a Ukrainian identity identifies him as or herself as a Ukrainian, and rejecting the being included violently into the Russian civilizational project is a Nazi. Hence the Nazification. Again, this is a genocidal program. But there are so many maps of this. So it's now, being very brief with my answer, is that it's not 2 categories, it's more. And also what changed is that what we do with those categories. So now many say that those normal Ukrainians who can be part of the Russian civilization project, they're a minority, but the majority needs to be just dealt with. And mimetic power. Yeah, I didn't mention this, but I do believe it's an interesting concept that I developed, and it has to do a lot with this trouble of the Russian language, of Russian official language, and the Kremlin language, Kremlin speak, that uses the same words that we associate with a particular phenomena, but they don't actually belong to that category. That Russia wants to be presented, but maybe now it's a bit different, but it wants to be presented like a normal country with normal institutions. And this is a huge psychological and linguistic problem. So when they say they have a parliament, it is not a parliament. They use this word parliament. In our interpretation, immediately, because we understand this world, we have in mind this institution where a debate takes place, where political parties exist, that there is an actual opposition, that there are debates and arguments about alternatives of Russian political developments. It does not exist. There is no such thing. When they say we hold elections, these are not elections. But we are trapped linguistically in this huge trouble. The best explanation that I could probably produce to explain this is the Russian Potemkin village, Potemkinskaya dеревня. It's a Potemkin state. It's not a real state. Those state institutions are not those state institutions. The constitutional court is not a court at all. They don't care about their institution, their constitution, which actually, in reality, it's a nice democratic document, but they don't live based on that document. And you can, those are not opposition parties that are present in the parliament. This is not real opposition. It's just a theater. It's like a theatrical play, and all the audience are those voters who go. But this is all, pre-designed roles for those people, and this is a problem. And this, I think, is what you referred to is much more sinister, because they are using the same words to produce particular images in our minds, and those are wrong images. This is
right now the Romanian media speaks about elections in Russia and possible frauds. Like those elections are fraud from the beginning. It's not a fraud. This is how they are designed.
Yes.
And
I cannot even say that those are unfree and unfair elections, because that will give a legitimacy of a bad process. But this is not even the election. This is not a plebiscite.
And they're talking about it, and they're giving it, some media give it as an example. Look, Russia, it's a war, but Russia still organizes elections, but Ukraine doesn't. We all know why Ukraine can't organize elections, of course, but they give this example like, look, Russia might be more democratic than Ukraine because they treat this as elections.
Can we? Yes. Yeah, let's move with a series of 3 interventions. One here. There were more hands before I remember. Lady over there, and there's one of the back. Please. The gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Doru Costa. I'm former ambassador. And congratulations for the organization of this meeting. And thank you very much, Doctor, for the presentation of your book. I'm eyeing that stack over there, hoping that I'll grab one. A couple of points. I'll try to be very short. Of course, I will fail. First of all, I think that we are trapped. We are trapped, as Mr. Evenimentul and you selves also, I think. In our language, we are very happily using political warfare, but we don't want to use propaganda. But we don't have but to change what we understand by it, and understand that this is a concept. A rule by law, and not the rule of law. That's a very interesting thing which happens to China, but let's don't go there. The second point is that there were several points, several moments when you mentioned the Russian narrative. We are not the West, quote unquote. All right, then what are you? Because this raises a huge problem for anybody who has a modicum of knowledge of Russian history. Peter the Great is one of the counselors for Mr. Putin, right? Well, Peter the Great wanted to Europeanize Russia. So did Katarina the Great. So what are we talking about here? If Russia is not the West, and we are persuaded that Russia is not the West, let's agree that we mean by West something that we agree to mean and don't develop that, right? It is not the West, fine. Then what shall we do with it? Russia is not going anywhere the day after. So the question is, how are we going to deal with Russia the day after? I don't want to go, although it's extremely tempting, to play on hypothesis. The day after means Russia is defeated, meaning what? The day after means Russia is victorious, meaning what? So let's just say the day after, right? Ceasefire. What can we do with Russia? And last, I have, that's a very personal thing, and I apologize for being too personal perhaps. But since we are talking about perceptions, because this is what political warfare is, perception. It means that reality is perceived some way, in a way or another. So we have reality, and now we have virtual reality, as if reality before was not enough. This is quite discouraging. And I think that there is a tendency to allow for a doomsday scenario to come, because we can't do anything about that. We can't go beyond the limits of democracy in order to fight autocracy who don't care and send tanks in Hungary, just like you said, and so on and so forth. So what can we do? Question, hence the question, perhaps the answer here would be to reform continuously and give examples. And I wrap it up by recalling what a sentence I loved in your expose. Russians living in Estonia know what it means, so they don't believe the other Russians. That's the key. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Actually, you may know there is an initiative in Brussels of the European Parliament, the Brussels Dialogue, and it had a conference last year called Russia the Day After. What they meant by this is the day after, say, the fall of Putin, or of the Putin regime. So what we can do about this. What I think will happen, because I think much of all what is happening is dependent on personality of Putin, on his personal obsessions, on his personal mental state. And the day after, I think there will be a very short window of opportunity for the West to do something about Russia, and think what will happen is a sort of a deal that will be proposed to the Russian elites. That you basically need to give gives us some of the figures for the Hague, for the International Criminal Court. Those people would be like people like Shoigu, some of the commanders, maybe Gerasimov. So that will be an exchange. Patrushev, Naryshkin. So, the Siloviki, the clan, maybe up to, I don't know, 10, 20 people. Yeah? And then there will be a deal that Russia will be proposed some sort of a, not contract, but some settlement that it can be probably gradually becoming, or being accepted into the Western community again, into the international community again. The progressive lifting of the sanctions in exchange for particular steps from the Russian side. There is a problem, though, which we should take into consideration. So Putin, in a way, is a consensus figure for the political elites, but not only political elites, but also business elites in the Russian Federation. So what is happening now, since Russia is developing a war economy, much of its infrastructure and business project, they move into the direction of sustaining the war. And this is these are long-term projects. So essentially the elites are now directly benefiting from the war going on. So the question is, even if Putin goes, would the elites be happy with ending the war because they benefit from this? I do believe that it would still be possible, because if they benefit economically, they can be bought. And I think that the West will be able to suggest a nice amounts of money to just buy them. Yeah, this is what you do with corrupt people. You just buy them. There is no other way. And there could be a deal yet to get some of the people processed at the criminal court.
I have a question.
Okay. So how much?
No.
I don't know.
No. My question is that since it's a sham state, it's rather a mafia, and a mafia works on the base of loyalty. That's a barrier, I would say.
Yes, I do agree that it's mostly a mafia state. Although now I would also describe Putin as a sort of a kleptocrat several years ago. But now I reject this identification. He has developed a worldview on the basis of which he acts. He has his historical delusions of grandeur. He has a mission, a historical mission to destroy Ukraine. He has even a messianist mission for Russia, for the Russian civilization. So he has developed this, and he will not stop. You know, he can only be stopped. He will not negotiate, because how can you propose to a person to negotiate his place in the Russian history? He will not negotiate. This is something, you know, this is about his legacy. There is nothing else to persuade him to behave in a different way. But other people, I think they are much more pragmatic, and they are corrupt, and they can be bought.
This is a long string of questions, an interesting answer, but let's pick it up where we left it, please. Over there, and there's another one at the end of the room. Please. We need a microphone over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Sânziana Iancu. I'm from the Euro-Atlantic Resilience Center. My question for you today would be, how has political warfare that you talked about, encompassing both soft power and more assertive measures such as cyber operations, information warfare, influenced international perceptions and diplomatic relations during the conflict with Russia? And what implications does this have for the future of conflict resolution and international law? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And the other one, the last of this series at the back of the room. So get back to the rule to have 3 questions in the same time.
Thank you. Victor Caracolacu, Senior Editor, National Radio Broadcasting Corporation. Sir, can you comment on the very recent statements coming from Paris from President Emmanuel Macron about a possible, plausible involvement of Western powers, European powers in Ukrainian conflict? Thank you.
Well, with political warfare, you know, it's one thing, disinformation, and cyber warfare is something very different. At least when we hear this term cyber warfare, we probably imagine a room of people with their laptops, you know, being engaged in some cyber operations. This is not how it works. Cyber operations are mostly about the disruption of the hardware and sometimes software. This is not a real warfare. Cyber operations are more, they're much more efficient when they're part of the conventional war, to disrupt the operation, to disrupt the command center interactions and communications. But none of the cyber operations in the recent history had a sort of a lasting effect. If they're not about hacking, and if they're not about stealing some sensitive information, probably you remember how many times except for the most recent hack of the Bundeswehr, the secret meeting, but how many times the Russians stole information and hacked the Bundestag? They did it several times, and now I wonder just why they haven't used anything. Probably because communications between German politicians were so boring. There was basically nothing to leak. But they did this. That was, cyber operations, and so what? There was not real cyber warfare. And obviously implications are enormous with disinformation. And let me give you one example, also about the success. Because as I said during my presentation, it's very difficult to measure success, but sometimes it's so obvious. I'm not very politically correct. With the success of disinformation is like identifying pornography. It's very difficult to identifying but when you see it, you know that yes, it is. So with the success of these political warfare and especially disinformation operations, one example is that during the discussions among the American political establishment in the US about the aid for Ukraine, they used the narratives that came right from the Russian disinformation sources, and also fringe ones, not even state-controlled media, but really fringe websites that would spread conspiracy theories about President Zelensky using financial aid from the US and American taxpayers to buy yachts, to buy luxury boats. And that was spread, and that was coming from really fringe marginal websites, and they became parts of the discussions between parliamentarians and congressmen and congresswomen in the US. And I found that a huge success. I cannot actually imagine how this whole links worked, how this fringe narrative traveled to the American establishment. A huge success. Yes, and implications are enormous. Imagine now basically the American aid is blocked. And partly because of the success of those narratives and similar narratives. So imagine you spend 5 minutes to create this theory on the internet and post somewhere on the fringe website, and you block billions, tens of billions of dollars in aid for the country that defends itself from the genocidal invasion. Just imagine, and this is also about this openness of the information system. This is unimaginable. And yeah, it shows the huge implications of disinformation, even if not so much was invested initially into the spread of that disinformation. Can you remind me? Just a few words. There was
the last one about, from the radio, national radio.
Oh,
Macron,
yes.
Military,
yes.
Western military in Ukraine.
No, look, Macron is playing a great game, in my opinion. He creates this, strategic ambiguity. That's the great word. How would you say it in French? Because I think it's beautiful in French.
Ambiguïté stratégique.
Yes, exactly. I think if it didn't sound too well in French, we would not use it. So he's doing this. I also know, and actually some of my colleagues took a very active part in this. It's promoting the idea that in France, in French, there was an idea that the Ukrainian war is our war. And we are not only helping Ukraine to win this war, but this is our war in which we should actually take part. And that was a narrative that appeared right after the invasion, or even before that in France, that this is also our war, and we have to take part in this. And whether the French will send the troops to Ukraine, now they are being even more specific. And this is interesting because I like Macron, but I never thought that he would go that far. It is the legacy, and yes, Mali, and he was humiliated in a way by the Wagner group, right? And he had to come back with something. But yeah, this is a very interesting development, and this also did not appear in the vacuum. If you remember, there was a proposition by former NATO General Secretary, who now works with the Ukrainian government. Rasmussen. Right, and he proposed that Western countries should send troops to Ukraine to defend those territories which are under sovereign control. Ukraine should be admitted to NATO, but the NATO troops will only protect those territories that are now currently under the control of the Ukrainian government, while Ukrainians will be given all the necessary hardware and military power to reclaim the lost territories. So that was his plan. So this Macron's ideas did not appear just out of the blue. That was part of the discussions, part of the international discussions, but also part of very specifically French discussions in France. So that's a good dynamic, I guess.
If I think, well, I mean, ambiguïté stratégique sounds even better in French than in English. It comes more naturally, you know, it's a bit more natural at its place. We started a few minutes late, so we have still time for one if something very urgent or somebody wants to raise a very burning issue. And if not, I have the privilege to ask you one last one, just 1 minute. What should we expect after these so-called Russian elections? Do you expect something very quickly and spectacular to change in the Kremlin's elite? Something to, some heads chopped off or something after this? He becomes more stabilized after these elections?
Well, I don't think it's about stabilization. What I do expect is that they will be doing alternative polling, alternative, probably even focus groups to measure the actual popularity of Putin, and depending on the findings of their research, which will never be public, obviously, they will have to make a decision on the further mobilization, whether it will be open mobilization, whether it would be like full-fledged mobilization, in contrast to the so-called partial mobilization. So that will be a decision that has to be made. And another point, I think, this mostly concerns those people who still live in Russia. I do think that you know, this has already started. This almost open terror against even the remnants of the most vegetarian types of the opposition in Russia. We have seen arrests of even people who collected signatures for one of the more or less democratic, but obviously not democratic candidates for these so-called elections. So they're using now openly like instruments of terror, of terrorizing the population, which may become even worse after the election. But that will depend on this, what I said, the actual research into the focus groups on. They will of course say it's 85%. He will win with this number, but they will also do their best in order to understand what's the actual popularity, and on that many further actions will depend.
So your prediction is back to the 30s, the Red Terror, broad scale.
Well, Russia has already thousands, I guess, of political prisoners. There is still a way to go, unfortunately, because Stalin, for him, that was millions.
Yeah.
So
maybe Ivan Groznik. I don't know how to say this in English.
Ivan the Terrible.
Ivan the Terrible. I think that's the more appropriate, in my view.
Yeah. Otilia, please, you have now the last word.
No, just so the repressions will be higher or lower depending on his popularity.
Okay, so it's direct or inverse correlation.
Yeah, I think it's probably a reverse correlation. I mean, if he's not that popular, probably they will. But that was mostly. It's not about repressions, but the mobilization, how far they can go, because they do research into all those social sentiments, like what the people really think or what they really believe, and they try to, because much of what Putin is doing, obviously there is this conventional warfare element, but with the domestic audience there is a lot of also political technology. I don't know how it will spread. It is in Romanian, this theatrical politics, about imitation of everything. Those are not real political processes. It's political technology. It's all manipulated. So, but they are still looking at the real numbers and the real sentiments, and they try to, be cautious sometimes. Sometimes they just openly start terrorizing people, but sometimes they still think about how they can go.
Thank you. And we said we would finish, but Romanians, it's hard, so that's just last one. Would it make any difference if Western powers or we don't recognize Putin after these elections? Because that's the solution of Yulia Navalnaya, and is it any practicality in this?
Well, first of all, this will not happen. There is a huge opposition to not recognizing Putin as the president, as re-elected president. and this huge opposition, the US, Germany, Hungary, so a very diverse number of states in the Western community. As for whether it will make any difference, symbolically, yes, but in practical terms, no. He will not do this. He will not do this, obviously. They will always, Western leaders will always need, someone to talk to anyway. It was quite fine with Lukashenko because Lukashenko does not matter, in the bigger picture. So it was easy. With Putin, it will not be that easy, and this is not happening.
Then it's time to thank all of you, starting with the audience, the media who were so interested yesterday and today. Thank you, our hosts, the Diplomatic Institute and Liliana especially, and thank you, Anton, for being here. And there are still 3 or 4 books, as I can see, so it will be our key performance indicator to leave you without any book when you go back to Vienna tomorrow.
Let me thank Sorin and
Please.
Otilia and Expert Forum for thinking of the Diplomatic Institute to host this event, which was extremely interesting and very rich in content. And we are looking forward to seeing you in Bucharest again.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, for hosting me for this discussion. Really much appreciated. Thank you.